of the NIH-sponsored center at the Boston University School of Medicine called the Language in the Aging Brain Lab, and in particular the Aphasia Research Center there. She has worked on language changes associated with both the healthy aging people and those afflicted with Alzheimer's. A single most appropriate description of her research interest would be to say that she has been studying the neurolinguistics of bilingualism over the last 3 decades or 4 decades. She has also pioneered and conducted dozens of studies, experimental empirical studies of the cross-cultural study of agrammatism, including on Kannada. And she has worked on something very interesting, the neuropsychology of talent, both people in terms of gifted as well as those who have dyslexia and so on. She has worked on the individual differences in second language acquisition. She is co-author or co-editor of several books, including one Language and the Brain, published by Cambridge University Press in 1999, Language and Communication in the Elderly, Neurobehavior of Language and Cognition, and the Bilingual Brain, of course, the one that I mentioned earlier. Her talk today will deal with bilingual executive control in avoiding language mixing despite brain damage. Did I say it right? Okay. There's a question mark there. Executive control has been an extremely important topic of research in psychology of language and psycholinguistics and in neurolinguistics. And language mixing has increasingly been an extremely important topic of research, and a challenging one, because one of the issues in this from the very beginning has been the notion of to what extent a bilingual is able to keep his or her languages separate. And this is how the issue was defined right in the 1960s, where by the pioneers of studies of the psycholinguistics of bilingualism, namely the people in McGill University, Kohlers and Fred Genesee and all these people, McNamara, etc. But unfortunately, I think the emphasis was on separation of the languages, and it was used as the touchstone for the competence of bilingualism. Even Weinreich, in his Languages in Contact in 1957 or 55, defined a successful bilingual as one who can keep his or her two languages apart. But several people who have worked on traditionally multilingual societies of Africa and Asia have questioned this assumption, and have talked about how, in a typical natural settings of bilingual language use, people do not necessarily keep the languages apart, but mix them and switch from one to the other appropriately according to the pragmatic circumstances. And so this raises another very important challenge to the definition of who is a successful bilingual, and also our characterization of what constitutes various deviations from this theoretical norm. And so it's particularly interesting that those questions are going to be addressed, I think, in today's talk. And I'm particularly interested because the data come from my language, Kannada, and Professor Obler has done several, and her students have done a lot of work on Kannada-related things, and she knows the area very well. And so the Center for India Studies is very happy to co-sponsor this event with Multilingual Intercultural Communication Center. And I would like also to use this opportunity to extend an invitation to all of you to attend a reception at the Center on the 5th floor of the library at 4:30 this afternoon.
Thank you both for these wonderful introductions. I hadn't known how I was doing on ResearchGate. I was told someone read an article of mine recently, so I wrote to her and I said, I bet you downloaded it. And we know ResearchGate exaggerates. So, they didn't promise. They told me she read it. And she said, well, not yet. So we'll see how far we trust them. And I'll be referring to your work later, so thank you, Beth. I put this school up because we're always looking for good doctoral students, and I'm sure some of you, all of you, would rather be doctoral students here if you're not already doctoral students, but just in case you wanted to head into Manhattan, I happen to bring some documents along, because I'll have my final slide. We'll have the deadlines if you decide it's neurolinguistics at the CUNY Graduate Center that you wanted to do. So the title of my talk is very dense. When I started out in linguistics, people would have cute titles and you couldn't tell what they were about. My title actually has a fairly dense noun phrases in it. I'm going to deconstruct it for you by way of introducing the talk. I'm guessing you've all heard of bilingual advantage. It would help me to know how many in the room identify as linguists, psycholinguists, you may have raised your hands already, psychologists, who am I missing? Speech language pathologists. Who am I missing? History interested generally. Kannada speakers. 2, okay. So you've probably all heard of this notion that Ellen Bialystok brought to us of the bilingual advantage. It's made the public science media. She's been publishing on it since 1994 with her colleagues. And what it means is better cognitive abilities, especially one called cognitive control, among bilinguals relative to monolinguals. She regularly reports it in studies over the years in children and in older adults, and sometimes in young adults as well. And there are other people in the field who sometimes find bilingual advantage in all 3 groups. I'm not fully convinced it exists. We have a doctoral student at the Graduate Center, not in my field, but in Ed Psych, who says the best predictor of which study is going to find bilingual advantage is the lab that the study is coming from. So, but I happen to be a co-author on a paper that finds bilingual advantage in young adults, but that hasn't convinced me that it can always be found. Even in Bialystok's work, it's often found according to, she gives several tests that might find it, and one shows the significant differences and the others don't. So, my research question that I'm going to focus on for the next, hopefully, 45 or 50 minutes, giving you time for questions, is if bilinguals have this bilingual advantage, can they avoid inappropriate language mixing even when they have brain damage? And I'll elaborate on that a bit. If bilinguals have enhanced executive control, I'll talk about what that means in more detail. As a result of years of avoiding mixing between their 2 languages, that's the explanation that Bialystok and others give. Do they avoid inappropriate language mixing even when they have brain damage that results in language disturbance like aphasia? So the secondary question that's of interest to me, because people who write about language mixing in people with aphasia who are bilingual, is whether lexical mixing in bilingual aphasia results from lexical retrieval problems. Patient can't find a word, happens often with monolingual patients with aphasia, that's why they choose the word from the other language. Or whether it results from problems with this executive control that tells me when I'm talking with Bob Hoberman, it's okay to speak English and Hebrew, but when I'm talking with Hunaida, it doesn't make sense to talk Hebrew. If I can come up with some Arabic, I should come up with some Arabic. And English, of course. So, or potentially both, of course. So, I said I would talk about the different components of the title of the talk. Bilingualism, executive control, language mixing, brain damage, in particular aphasia. For the purposes of this talk, when I use the term bilingualism, I'm usually a little more liberal, but today I'm going to talk about using 2 or more languages on a regular basis from an early age, let's say pre-puberty, and continuing into adulthood. So now I'm turning to executive control, which I'll take a little more time on because I figure we all can agree for the purposes of today's talk to use that definition of bilingualism. Executive control is a little tougher to define. It's sometimes called executive functions. I think in my original title for the talk, I called it executive functions. Executive control feels a little more meaningful to me. It is the brain's ability to govern itself, to attend, pay attention as appropriate, to inhibit interference, to plan, to make decisions, and to monitor oneself, among other related phenomena. Some people include working memory here, to keep information in mind while you might need to go back because the sentence turned out to be ambiguous to this point and you need to reparse it, for example. So when bilingual control is talked about vis-a-vis the bilingual advantage, when executive control is talked about, Bialystok has been reporting these advantages, and she's been reporting them, interestingly, for non-language abilities, for, as I said, bilingual children and older adults. So she says the test I'm about to show you, bilinguals do better on because for all these years they've had practice avoiding mixing languages, and this executive control that results has given them a generalized ability to avoid interference. So, the tests include two that I'm going to talk about today. There's a third, but I'll be giving you an example of the two. Stroop test and a flanker test. So in the Stroop test, there's a in each of these tests, there's a congruent and an incongruent condition. In the congruent test, do it along with me. Just please name the ink color, okay? That's going to be red on the left. Can we do it together? Red, blue, green, orange, blue, green, red, orange, blue, green. Not hard, even if you're not a native speaker of English, not hard. In the incongruent condition, same task. Name the ink color, okay? Do it with me, please. Orange, green, blue, orange, green, red, blue. First two aren't so hard. After that, we start stumbling, don't we? It's not a hard task. It's made hard because we can't not read in a language we know. Okay? So, but your brain knows what it's supposed to do, and it controls, like an executive, what you're supposed to be doing so we can do it. It just takes us longer. Now, that's not really a non-language task, although it's one of the ones that Bialystok talks about. But there are more non-language tasks. So there's one that's called the flanker task. In the congruent position task, you're supposed to press the button that the middle arrow points to. So which button would you press here? Number 2, exactly. In the incongruent condition, you press the button the middle arrow points to again. And that doesn't look as hard as as naming the colors was in the incongruent condition. But again, if you have a series of these stimuli, and they're pretty fast-paced, we can see that you respond slower in this incongruent condition than the congruent one because your brain needs to remind itself to pay attention not to the overall direction that most of the arrows are pointing in, but only the one opposing it, that the middle arrow is pointing to. So, bilingual children are better than this, at this than monolingual children, due to keeping the two languages separate, or due to practicing over the years, switching between the two languages via their frontal executive brain networks, which I will talk about soon. Older adults are better too than monolinguals at such tasks. Obviously, we older adults have more practice at keeping the languages separate than the children do. And the brain regions that have been implicated, when I started in this field, when I wrote the book, The Bilingual Brain, there was a set of case studies. There were 106 of them at the time that we were able to review across the languages that I knew. And when people talked about a language switch that broke down in aphasia, it was always somewhere else in the brain. Now, there were only 4 or 5 such articles, but I came away concluding that there's nowhere in the brain that's responsible for its 4 or 5 very different areas. The truth of the matter is more recent research by Abutalebi and Green says, there are 4 regions that are associated with switching problems in bilingualism, and you can find them problematic for anyone who's bilingual, who has brain damage, who has switching problems. The problems are going to be most of interest for us today in prefrontal cortex, this is a brain. Well, you see the ear, so you know this person is facing forward, and we're looking at a horizontal slice of the brain. This is the prefrontal cortex in the frontal lobe. I'll show you frontal lobe in a different picture soon. This is a medial cortex, the ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex. The basal ganglia are subcortical structures that are involved in memory and control of language, but not language per se. Language per se tends to be cortical areas on the external cortical side of the left hemisphere. And the fourth one is the inferior parietal lobule. So just to give you an idea that this is, I was once at a conference symposium with 6 speakers, and this particular slide was shown 5 times by 5 different speakers. So let me turn then to aphasia. I'm assuming some of you know what aphasia is, and a number of you don't. And those of you who do are the speech-language pathologist for sure, and some of you who are psycholinguists and neurolinguists, and some of you who have some member of your family or friend who has had aphasia over the years. Aphasia, I will define as language disturbance that results from brain damage. And it has been associated with atypical language mixing in bilinguals with aphasia, who I am going to call BWA. I think I've got it consistent across the slides now. In the classic sense, if we have to talk about 19th century thinking about neurolinguistics, there's 2 basic sorts of aphasia. One is fluent or Wernicke's aphasia. I'm not going to talk so much about that today. And the other I want to focus on is non-fluent or Broca's aphasia. It's the most common type of aphasia from stroke, at least. So now we're looking at the left hemisphere from the side in the picture on the right of your slide. And we see there's an area called Broca's area. Broca's the person who said, hey, if you have damage here, he actually was, it turns out the patients he was talking about had much larger damage, but includes that Broca's area. If you have damage here, you have trouble producing speech, but not so much comprehending it. And then Wernicke came along in 1874 and said, hey, there's another type of language problem. If you have trouble comprehending speech, but not trouble producing speech, except if you can't comprehend your own speech, you don't make much sense when you talk, because you're not self-monitoring to check that you make sense, that it's related to a lesion in what we now call Wernicke's area. So, in Broca's aphasia, as I said, patients have trouble producing speech. They have relatively good comprehension, so we know they understood our instructions and the tests we'll give them. And as with any aphasia, they have lexical retrieval problems. How many of you ever have problems remembering the word you want to say? Yep. When I explain to people that older people have more of those than younger people, 30-year-olds tell me, 20-year-olds tell me, but that happens to me sometimes. Of course, it happens in a language we're not fully proficient in, and I assure you, on average, it happens more with advancing age. So, and even more with any sort of damage to the language areas of the brain. So, excessive mixing of languages, if you're a bilingual with aphasia, might result. Brain damage in Broca's aphasia regularly involves part of the frontal lobe, as I showed you, but it's the posterior frontal lobe. It's not the prefrontal. So it's this part towards the back of the frontal lobe, not the perifrontal regions, which include, depending on your definition, these regions here, that have been associated with executive control. So I turn now to language mixing as I'm getting to why executive function control is of importance for thinking about bilingual language mixing. You probably know it can also be called language switching or code mixing, as in the famous title of Poplack's 1979 was the working paper. I think 1980 is the talk. Sometimes I start a sentence in English, italiano, and español, right? Sometimes I start a sentence in English and end in Spanish. Some people carefully distinguish the two. Mixing is for single words, that's how I'm going to use the term today, and switching is between sentences. In aphasia, there have been claims that bilinguals with aphasia mix more than healthy controls. But there hasn't been anyone who quantified if it's true. People simply observed it. And moreover, they've observed it, or there was 1 or 2 papers where they've counted, There have been very small samples of individuals, 1 to 4. Plus, there's a methodological problem that examiners themselves were bilingual. Franco Fabro does this in his book, The Neurolinguistics of Bilingualism, and in related papers. So if I say to Bob, now I want us to speak only in English, and he throws in some Hebrew, that's actually not a language problem. It's perfectly appropriate because he knows I speak Hebrew. Whereas if Agnes starts talking to me in Chinese, she knows that I've only had 1 semester of Chinese and that it really doesn't make sense to do it. So that we might say is a language or an executive function or a pragmatic problem, right? But she wouldn't do that, of course. So the problem isn't a language problem. It's doing something perfectly appropriate, but rather it's a problem with following the directions. And if you have brain damage, you might have more problems following directions as a result of executive control problems. So I'll be talking to you about the work of Avanti Paplakar, a doctoral student of mine, which is in preparation. She's hoping, we're all hoping, it'll be completed this year. Her goal was to quantify the amount and the types of mixing employed both by bilinguals with aphasia and matched healthy controls. And she matched for age and education and proficiency in one's first and second languages. She had a population, as Sridhar said, of patients with aphasia who are speaking Kannada and English. For those of you who don't know where Kannada is spoken, it's spoken in the Indian state of Karnataka by millions of folks. And it's a particularly good population, these bilinguals, because there are many of them are bilinguals. There's, quote, lots of mixing in India. It's socially appropriate to mix languages. Education can be in English medium schools, certainly is necessarily after the 10th grade, if you continue on after the 10th grade. And for a sizable population, it's in English, Indian English medium schools from the 1st grade. So the level in Indian English can be quite high. And Indian English is a variety of English that's virtually intelligible to speakers of standard American English. Doesn't differ in too many important ways. Now, Kannada English is a good population for me to talk about in this audience because Sridhar wrote the book on Kannada in his modern Kannada grammar, and the 2 doctors, Sridhar, have written an article on code switching and give examples of mixing between languages that include Kannada. Not all people who write, like when Chana Paplak was writing, she was not writing on examples of Kannada. It's also morphologically very interesting, different from English. So let me give you some examples of mixing in a healthy speaker, no aphasia here, who of Kannada and English. I'm not going to read without some embarrassment the Kannada parts of this, but because we put the English in red, you can see that a couple of nouns and a noun phrase have been borrowed. And they've been appended in 2 instances with the postposition or preposition ga. The translations I have underneath my examples of actual speech that was produced. So this is a standard mixing of English into Kannada. There are rarer types of mixing, like phrase mixing, a sentence which translate to, I will see if it's possible. And morphological mixing, which happens to fascinate me, but unfortunately it's very rare. You have to look at a lot of data to see it. Chair, no, they got it. Where no, I guess, is a marker of the object, the direct object of the sentence. So, and when I'm talking about bilingual mixing and aphasia, I'm going to be focusing on lexical mixing in particular. Here's an example of a patient who has Broca's aphasia who is supposed to be telling a story of what's happening on the left. This gives you a nice example of how in Broca's aphasia, speech is very effortful. So here I am going to try and to give you an idea of what it sounds like when a patient with Broca's aphasia is looking at this picture and has to tell the story. Ili road, ide ele factory, ide hoga, ide factory in the hode. You get the idea. And at the end, in blue, this is a patient who was trilingual, who also knew Hindi. And he ends the statement with a word I recognize because it was Arabic originally, bas, meaning enough, sufficient, right? So again, you see a lot of nouns are borrowed, right? And one noun phrase. And you also see there's a fair amount of repetition, as happens in patients with aphasia, particularly patients with anterior aphasias, front of the brain problems. So the argument has been that bilingual patients with aphasia mix more frequently than healthy controls would, and it's been linked speculatively to problems with lexical retrieval. When you can't find the word, you speak it in the other language if it comes to you. And it's been these findings have been based on small n studies. The question about executive control networks is whether they remain untouched in aphasia, like Broca's aphasia. If executive control networks are only the prefrontal regions that Abu Talebi and Green reported, that four-region system, there should be no executive control problem in people with Broca's aphasia. But that's been a part of the argument, that it's not just problems with lexical retrieval, but also there's less executive control operating in people with brain damage. So, and particularly with aphasia. I have to tell you that no one's ever said, these individuals, bilinguals with aphasia, have executive problems in daily life, as compared to what they say about Phineas Gage. You've perhaps heard of Phineas Gage. He was a respectable railroad administrator, worker, who one day tamped down the railroad tie the wrong way, and it went through his left frontal lobe. And there's one picture of how that, it went through and it came out. And he didn't die. He not only didn't die, but he had no language problems, which is surprising. But basically, the reason is that the pole was going through frontal regions of his brain that are responsible for what we can link to executive control, but not regions that are involved in language, showing those can be separable. So the problems he had were he would curse, he couldn't plan, he would overspend his money, and he was terribly rude, and people basically said, he's not the same guy. So, whoops, there's a little note to me. So, my hypotheses in this study are, if bilinguals are resistant to inappropriate mixing as a result of their years of bilingualism-related executive control practices, there should be no differences between mixing in healthy controls and mixing in bilinguals with aphasia. Even patients with anterior lesions, Broca's patients with Broca's aphasia, should show no inappropriate mixing, since inappropriate mixing is presumably due to damage to prefrontal control networks outside the classic language area. That is, it's due to problems in Broca's area and regions posterior and deep to it, behind it and deep to it. So, in this study, our participants were 32 Kannada-English bilinguals with Broca's aphasia. And they had to not only have Broca's aphasia, some people with Broca's aphasia are very hard to understand. We needed to be able to understand what they were saying, particularly with respect to possible mixing of words. So we took ones whose speech was intelligible. And 32 healthy Kannada-English bilinguals who were matched for age, education, and proficiency. Obviously, we're getting around the small n study issue by having this many participants. They were aged approximately 60 years old in both groups. Their education was approximately 14 years in both groups. Their age of English language acquisition was about 10, as young as 4, and as old as 17. If you're 17 and your English has been pretty good for a while and you're now 83 or even 60, you've been using English for a pretty long time. And indeed, the self-rated proficiency of the individuals with aphasia in their Kannada before the stroke, pre-stroke, was 5 on a scale from 1 to 5. Their self-rated proficiency in English was 4.38 before the stroke, and for the 3 of them who had Hindi, it was 2.83. You see how comparable that is to the healthy controls. Kannada was 5. There was no stroke, so it remains 5. Their English was 4.5, not significantly different from the 4.38. And their Hindi, but that's only for 3 people, was slightly better. But for 3 people, it can't be significantly different. You do see that there was change in both languages. This is what standardly happens in aphasia, although you wouldn't know this if you only read the literature where the interesting cases come. But standardly, if your proficiency was highest in Canada premorbidly, it's going to be highest postmorbidly after the stroke, that is to say. If your English was second best before, it's going to be second best. And for the three people, etc., who knew Hindi, it's going to be not very good. So we're going to focus, and you will see the mixing is primarily English, and the examples I'll give today is only between English and Kannada. Now, there were two types of tasks the participants had to do. We gave them an aphasia test to check that they had aphasia in both languages and that they were moderately severe. If anyone was too severe, if they had too big of comprehension problems, we couldn't test them. And if they were not very severe at all, they might not show up as having aphasia. And then we gave them 6 discourse tasks. Because we're talking about mixing and discourse, that's when it's interesting, of course. They had a set of personal narratives about their stroke. People get pretty good at telling the story what happened in the stroke, because a lot of doctors, speech-language pathologists, ask them that. It's a big event in their personal history. A vacation, a happy event, a sad event, 3 total of those. And then a set of picture descriptions. I only brought one of the picture descriptions here. I don't know if you've ever driven in India. Well, I guess I mostly go to cities when I'm in India, so there's more people on the roads. But this is a nice simplified picture that nevertheless has a story you could tell with it. So there were 3 conditions for these materials. There was a Kannada-only condition where you had to only speak Kannada. There was an English-only condition, and there was a it's fine to mix like you normally would condition. So here we had to get around the fact that the examiners in this case knew all 3 languages. And how we did this was, I think, a pretty clever idea. We had video clips that then were reinforced by the trilingual examiner. So in the English-only condition, the patients would see a video, or the healthy folks would see a video, and the person on it would say, "Hi, my name is Loraine. I will be listening to your story. And I only speak English, so please use only English in your response." Right? So they took it seriously. Kannada was the same, except the name wasn't Loraine, and it wasn't me in the video clip, but someone who putatively looked like someone who would only speak Kannada and not know English. And in the mixing okay conditions, "Hi, my name is Samana." Actually, I'm giving you only in English. These instructions were actually mixed between English and Kannada. "My name is Samana. I'll be listening to your story, and I speak both Kannada and English," so you could mix the 2 languages as you normally do. And this was the task that was done first, because everyone would be more comfortable. The other 2 tasks were counterbalanced, so half the people did the English only first, half did the Kannada only first. The recorded video instructions were played once before the start of each language condition. And then, if the participants mixed languages in one of the monolingual conditions, the examiner systematically reminded them, but only the first time, not to mix languages. So, the recordings were transcribed, and there was very high interrater reliability, both in the transcriptions and in coding the items. Each word was coded as being in Kannada, English, or Hindi. Borrowed words were separated out. Don't think that's easy. From mixed language, mixed words. We found a rule that we could live with on that. And we carefully distinguished the 2, and our raters coded for the differences. And then it turns out our participants assumed that they should avoid these words too, the borrowed word. And a list of language mixed items, as the ones I'm talking about today, was extracted from the transcription. So what were the results? You remember the research questions. If bilinguals have enhanced executive control as a result of years of avoiding mixing between their 2 languages, and they don't have damage in those 4 regions of the brain where that have been linked to mixing, do they avoid inappropriate language mixing even when they have brain damage that results in language disturbance, that is aphasia? And the secondary question was, does lexical mixing in bilingual aphasia, when it happens, result from lexical retrieval problems? I'll be able to give approximate answers to both those. It turns out those appear to be yes-no questions. The answers, however, are not simple yes-no answers. So the general results, not surprisingly, the bilinguals with aphasia produced significantly fewer words, 41, on average than the healthy controls on both tasks and in every condition. Let me show you how that looks in the next slide. The 2 left-hand triads of bars are the healthy controls. with the number of words in this instance, around 80, and with patients with aphasia, there were half as many words produced. As a result, all the rest of the data I'm going to talk about are not numbers, but rather percentages. They're not absolute numbers, but rather percentages, right? To control, if you only speak half as many words, then we wouldn't want to say, and you mix 10% of the time, we wouldn't want to say that you mix much less if both groups mix 10% of the time, right? So, with respect to the question of whether bilinguals with aphasia are like healthy controls, they did in fact mix more than the healthy controls, but they did it differently across the different conditions. And the interesting bars you see here, this is then the percentage of total lexical mixing. The interesting bars are the red bars, right? So the green bars are mixing in the it's okay to mix condition. Who mixed pretty much only in the it's okay to mix condition? Can you see those words at the bottom? It's the healthy controls in both personal narratives and picture description. Those groups. So they did mix some. Now there was some mixing of the healthy controls in the Canada only condition, but very little. By contrast, the patients with aphasia did mix in the Canada only condition. If you thought, they were told that Samana, whoever the speaker was, only speaks Kannada, and they mixed English in. As much as they mixed when it was okay to mix. What they were good at was talking to me. They mixed more than the healthy controls, but way less than they mixed when it was okay to mix. So that's where you see it's not a simple yes-no response. The mixing also was much more variable across the bilinguals with aphasia than it was in the healthy controls, as you'll see in the next 3 slides. So this is a scatter plot. I used age at the bottom for another talk we were doing on how age interacts here, which is it doesn't. And each circle here is a person with aphasia. Each circle here is a healthy control. And you see how the healthy controls are pretty much all doing the same amount of mixing, whereas people with aphasia, you get people who do a whole lot of mixing, and you get people who do very little mixing, right? That was true in the Kannada-only condition. It's also true in the English-only condition, although remember, there was less mixing by the people with aphasia in the English-only condition, still a fair amount of variability. And it's certainly true in the mixing when mixing was okay condition. The healthy controls allowed to mix. This is presumably what normals do in their daily speech. Mixed less and more consistently than the patients with aphasia. So, with respect again to whether patients with aphasia are like the healthy controls, the healthy controls mixed most when mixing was okay. That's pragmatically most appropriate. The bilinguals with aphasia mixed significantly less in the English-only condition. That's pragmatically appropriate than in the other 2 conditions, one of which they should have been mixing less. So let's look at the percent of total lexical mixing again. That slide you saw before with the means. You're disappointed in the results. No, you have somewhere else you have to be. Okay. So reminding you the healthy controls were mixing quite appropriately, and we have this odd picture. What's the story in India? Is it in fact true that everybody mixes all the time, or are there asymmetries of mixing direction? That's going to turn out to be the story. So, percentage of English words mixed in, percentage of Kannada words mixed in. The pictures are similar, except there are many more English words mixed in to the Kannada than there are Kannada words mixed into the English. That's what happened. Avanti wasn't surprised at all when I pointed this out. She said, oh yeah, that's how it works. You're nodding too?
Absolutely.
Yeah, sure. So, but so much for that rule. So the bilinguals with aphasia did use executive control, presumably, to mix much less in English than in the mixing okay condition. Oddly, they mixed as much in the Kannada only as in the mixing okay condition. And this asymmetry of direction mixing is apparently quite common in Karnataka. I wouldn't be surprised if mutatis mutandis it was similar across Indian states. It's not the case then that all mixing is common in India. It's that mixing English words in, and perhaps Hindi words in the north, I wouldn't know about that, is more common. So with respect to the first question, the bilinguals with aphasia did mix more than the healthy controls, but they were able to avoid mixing even when using their less proficient language. Remember, it was somewhat 5-4, less proficient, suggesting a fair amount of spared executive control, which we expect given where their lesions, their brain damage must be. Now, we recently did an analysis of word class because I thought we might get an answer there about is it a lexical retrieval problem? And there's a strikingly similar pattern of word class use between the two groups. So in this picture, the blue bars are the healthy controls, and it's the percentage of each syntactic constituent. And this is similar to what we found across 14 languages in other work I've done with colleagues. So the nouns, did you know that nouns are about 35-40% of your speech? True in English. This is across the languages here. And verbs are about half so often. Well, sure, we have transitive verbs that take a noun as a subject and a noun as a direct or indirect object. And we got adjectives. Conjunctions are pretty high up, actually. Adverbs, pronouns. But mostly what I want you to take away is these differences are not significant differences. These little differences between the two groups, rather it's a striking similarity. But there's a different pattern of lexical mixing. The bilinguals with aphasia had proportionally more mixing of nouns, verbs, and adjectives, and conjunctions. I'm going to ignore that today, than of the rest of the functors. Let me show you that slide. So blue is the percentage of lexical mixing per word class. So we know that the healthy controls in blue were mixing less than the patients with aphasia. But the proportion of mixing of the patients with aphasia was much higher for nouns, verbs, adjectives, and conjunctions. Nouns, verbs, adjectives, I would have expected adverbs to be next. It's actually relatively high if we look at the proportion, but it's going to be true for both adverbs and for pronouns. I asked Avanti whether that was because, for example, you might call the word very an adverb and someone might use very a lot, because we've seen this repetition among the patients with aphasia. She said, no, for the conjunctions, what people are mixing is mostly and, the English word and, which doesn't surprise me that patients with aphasia, when they're selecting a conjunction, are using a very common one, the word and, rather than interesting ones like therefore, which we tend not to see. But the adverbs were not the same word over and over again, but different words. So, my conclusions before I turn to you for questions, discussion. Proportionally more lexical mixing by the bilinguals with aphasia than the healthy controls. In all three conditions, I didn't show you those slides, but they're complex to look at, as Munoz et al. And Chankappa et al. Had asserted earlier, but not counted. Now we've seen the numbers for it. For both groups, there was markedly more mixing of English into Kannada in the Kannada-only condition than vice versa. And the asymmetrical mixing was not surprising. And the relative prestiges of English as a global language, I'm guessing, could result in the more mixing of it into Kannada than vice versa. But there could be other explanations for why that's happening. With respect to the secondary question about lexical mixing in bilingual aphasia resulting from lexical retrieval problems or from problems with executive control or both, we've seen that there's quantitatively more aphasia mixing across languages. So the question is whether that's executive control problems or lexical retrieval ones. Qualitatively, in some ways, the bilinguals with aphasia have virtually similar patterns of speech. So they're, in a sense, normal qualitatively. All their mixing is appropriate in some sense. That is, it's not odd parts of speech used in unusual ways, but it is excessive quantitatively. So I conclude that it appears that bilinguals with aphasia can significantly diminish their mixing when speaking with monolingual interlocutors of English, at least ones they've seen on a video clip. And like healthy controls, they're much more likely to mix English words into Kannada frames than vice versa. We may thus conclude that their extra mixing, which is distributed across all word classes, is the result of lexical retrieval difficulties rather than a loss of lexical control. I want to thank particularly Avanti Paplakar, who who persuaded me that it was okay to do a discourse analysis dissertation after I told her I spent a decade doing discourse analysis work and she couldn't imagine how time-consuming it was, and collected this very interesting data, and to several people who helped me put this presentation together, and to my lab members generally who gave me feedback on a practice presentation yesterday. And I want to thank you and remind you that if you just happen to be interested or know someone who would be interested in applying to our doctoral programs, I'm actually in speech language hearing sciences more, but I sometimes get students from linguistics down the hall. I have materials from the speech language hearing science program with me and from the Graduate Center General. Thank you.
Loraine, I'd be happy to distribute those flyers if you want
Great.
me to.
I will
So as
leave
we,
them here with you. Thank you.
we do have some time for questions and discussions. In the meantime, I'll be passing out.
I didn't bring enough for everybody for sure. So if you want one, take one, and if you send them back, you could leave them on the appropriate bulletin board. Yes, Nancy.
The answer to this is probably no, but it seems to me one logical thing to do is to use these same tasks in patients with prefrontal lesions as spare purposes.
Yes.
I mean, what would
Yes.
pure executive control disability do on these tasks?
Did everyone hear Nancy's question? It was the next group of the next people who need to be studied would be people who have pure frontal lesions, prefrontal lesions. That is, who only have, like Finney's gauge, right? It's not easy to find such people. The reason we see as much aphasia as we do, which is maybe less than we used to, is people get strokes from certain ways that the blood is distributed in the brain. And so it's relatively common to see the kind of strokes that result only in the language area difficulties. And
But head trauma lesions could be.
head trauma lesions will certainly give you frontal damage. They're messy from a research perspective because don't get head trauma if you have a choice, guys. Because your brain bounces in your skull,
Yeah.
so lesions tend to be in a number of places. Obviously, we don't want to do the Finney's gauge one. And we can't do rat studies in neurolinguistics because rats don't talk yet. Not to mention be bilingual. But if you had 3 such patients, wouldn't that be interesting? Or if we had someone who was doing a lot of code switching, inappropriate code switching. You know what does inappropriate language choice is patients with Alzheimer's disease. So, unlike people with aphasia who really maintain the ability to know, I got these languages with this person, this language with this person, this language with these people, people with Alzheimer's disease lose that ability and often revert to a first language. Patients with aphasia, when they show differential recovery, they don't go back to their first language necessarily. Patients with Alzheimer's disease go back to the first language, and their grandkids say, but he talks to me in blank, and I don't know any blank, for example. So we could, once we get better at finding out exactly where the lesions are in Alzheimer's disease, that might be a place to look at this. But Alzheimer's disease is messy in different ways. It's not just a single region of the brain. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, probably starting with the Frieder and Frieder paper that you mentioned at the beginning. There's been a lot of syntactic research into the patterns that we get with code mixing, like verb final languages work one way and verb initial languages work another way, and the places where you can allegedly switch seems to have been a big discussion topic, or languages with articles that carry all person, number, gender, things, whether you can switch there into another language that doesn't have those, and just these different switching points. And if there is some kind of grammatical control over when you can switch and when you can't switch, that is sort of bound up in the different syntactic properties of the languages that you're controlling, it would seem that you might get different kinds of switching patterns if the grammatical control part was not working or working, versus if it's a lexical retrieval thing, I mean, just kind of a naive sort of interpretation of how that would work. You can't think of the word, so you just pull it in regardless of what kind of a grammatical context you're pulling that thing into. So in those cases you might get patterns that would be quite different from what supposedly shows up in the kinds of well-behaved syntactic code switching.
So here's what I'm taking from what you're suggesting. The fact that, as far as we've looked at it, which isn't 100%, it's not something I can do because I don't know kind of at all, hardly. As far as we've looked at it, all the code switching happens appropriately, syntactically appropriately. And there's that discussion about how when two languages are similar, like Spanish and English, code switching only occurs at those instances where there's similarities on both points, before and after of the switch. Whereas in perhaps markedly more structurally different languages like Japanese and English, there are still rules, but there tend to be more lenient rules as to when you can code switch. Kannada and English, I think in this regard, are relatively similar, even though Kannada has a whole lot more postpositions than English. They are bound morphemes, but they don't involve substantial morphophonological changes. So we haven't seen any odd switches in the patients, which would be interesting were we to see them. That's another reason I say we're not seeing inappropriate switching in those patients. Yeah.
So a couple quick questions about the patients. So really about inclusion criteria. And did you also have access to for these groups to the actual lesion patterns? To the actual lesion patterns, right? So and things like
we have descriptions of the lesions. We've done in the Western world today. We would hope to select only patients who had been given MRI scans in the same scanner at a time close to when we were actually testing them.
So what were you actually
We
working?
had descriptions of where the lesions were. They're not like when I started at the VA in Boston 30 years ago. You know, frontal lesion extending posteriorly, large posterior. Well, these were frontal, but not anything that we can take into account in this.
How much variability was there in these descriptions? I mean, you get a lot of different lesion patterns that can lead to a Broca's profile. I guess with respect to trying to get at this question of what might be about areas like Broca's that we think might be involved in retrieval and selection and all this kind of stuff versus circuits that we think are doing these these executive function kinds of jobs, right? I mean, how much variability was there?
I want to answer fair. There was a fair amount of variability. As you said, there's a lot of different lesions that can result in Broca's aphasia, speech patterns, comprehension patterns. But I frankly didn't pay a lot of attention to them because I'm waiting for the next study that we can do with MRI.
So this is kind of related to Nancy's question, actually, right? So I mean, the thing I thought you were going to tell us about, I didn't hear. I'm wondering if you actually did it, which was to get executive control measures from these
Yeah,
guys.
right.
Right. So I mean, it would have been nice to correlate, their behavior on a flanker test, because like the scatter plot you showed, there's really, I mean, it's a platform, right? But there must be. Yeah. So I mean, you might. It would be a nice thing to like maybe in a follow-up, right? I mean, even if you can't actually see the patients, to see whether differences in executive function in these patient groups, right?
100%. You're absolutely right. That's why I made it clear that this was my paper using data from my students. Because over the years that Avanti's been working on this, I realized there's definite interest in what she's looking at, which is the distribution. And she's interested in cheaper tasks, a more formal and less formal, and across the conditions. But I realized that if the all stuff is right, we should be seeing maybe even less severe aphasia in bilinguals. So you probably were hoping that we had some sort of control that was monolingual control, but I'm really saying monolingual control. But that would be another piece to make this a full research project. So that's why we don't have those tests. I agree with you. It would be very important. My prediction, based on everything I've seen, is that these patients would perform close to the healthy control, much closer to the healthy control on the
Say flanker test.
on the flanker test would be better one than the stroop because they're going to have production problems for the word of the other. And of course, when you're talking about Broca's aphasia, most patients will have hemiplegia, so they can't use their dominant hand. So we have to figure. But I would not expect that they have great difference. I guess what we want to look at is the difference between the congruent and incongruent conditions. We predict that that would be similar proportions, even if it take longer, it would be similar for those patients. But we don't have those data, and Avanti needs to finish her degree. And we already have plans with several papers that will come out that aren't going into the dissertation, postdoctorate. But I'm going to add that one in because potentially it's not impossible to relocate some of these of the participants.
Right. And about the asymmetry switching, possibly this is a silly suggestion, but how often do you encounter monolingual counter speakers?
so there are lots of others who are monolingual speakers also. So it's not impossible to find. If I may continue, do other people have questions?
I gather some people need to leave. Feel free to leave. I don't take it personally. And I'm happy to stay around and talk because I don't have anything until
That's
4:30,
okay,
right?
3:30,
But
3:30.
No, there is an interview.
I have an interview
Yeah.
with you. Good. Okay. So I'm
Before
happy
you
right
leave,
now. Or
please fill out our survey before you leave. Thank you.
yes.
Oh, it's important.
Yeah, I know. Thank you for this most stimulating paper. And you are certainly right. There is enough scope here for another dozen papers from studies. Just a couple of observations. One was about the asymmetry and the directionality of switching. It is in general true that there would be more switching of English into Kannada than Kannada into English. And you gave many reasons. One of them was the global prominence of English and also prominence of English within India. And but most importantly, I think is the fact that English is the medium of instruction in higher education, and that becomes the dominant language when you are talking about things in general, especially technical things. And so the fact that it is the medium of instruction for many people, and so that affects the proportion of the direction of the speech. The second thing was, even though that is in general true, depending on the topic you are talking about, it is possible that even when you are speaking English, there would be a lot more Kannada. So once I had an ethnographic, I did a study, I'll send it to you, of somebody giving a religious discourse in English to a multilingual audience.
Yeah.
And here in America. So this was given by a physicist priest. He was a physicist by training, but priest by vocation. And he was talking about Indian mythology and religion, Hinduism, and so on. And so because of the topics, there was so much of Indian words mixed into that. So again, if it is a culturally defined topic that they are talking about in English, there would be a lot of Kannada words, for example. Exactly. So in other words, it would be topic governed and not simply neutral across all conditions.
And would they mostly be nouns and some verbs and nothing else?
Usually it would be, but then another topic for paper would be the syntactically more complex things of the kind that Dan Feiner talked about just now. That is, much of this mixing would be, of course, the biggest proportion would be nouns, but there would be a lot of phrases. So complex noun phrases with relative clauses and complement clauses and all kinds of things, dative subject constructions and so on.
Would also be included.
It would be included in the mixing.
Physics talk. Yeah, well, there certainly could include generally, but
Right.
in the physics talk, you need some of the concepts
Yes.
that we're going, the religious concepts.
Right.
Nouns.
So not just the nouns, but also he would bring in whole quotations and
okay. Textual.
exactly.
Textual, okay.
Right.
Sure.
Right. And things of that.
Yeah, and so addition, I think you should also get Dan's point about the syntactic issues, because I look at discourse and interaction, so I'm concerned with, you have people who speak to a prompt,